Politics, a bit of a change of pace now. The UK's chief Brexit negotiator has insisted that Britain must be able to set laws that suit itself once it fully breaks away from the EU. During a speech in Brussels last night, David Frost said that Britain will not accept EU supervision to create those level playing fields. So, can the UK achieve the open and fair arrangement it seeks with the European Union? Joining me to discuss this, the former European Commission negotiator, Thomas Cole, Andrew McDougall, the former Communications Director, to the Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper during those 7 years of trade talks with the EU, and Georgina Wright is an EU expert at the Institute for Government specialising in trade negotiations. A panel very pertinent to today's discussion. Thank you all for being here. Look, ahead of what we heard from David Frost last night, we knew from the French Foreign Minister at Munich that, on trade, the mechanism for future relations, we are going to rip one another apart. Ursula von der Leyen, Michel Barnier, both of them have cast doubts of us getting an agreement by the end of this year. After hearing from Mr. Frost last night, Georgina, do you agree with them?
Well, I think at the start of negotiations, you always expect both sides to present a very tough negotiating position. I think the question is, what does that landing zone look like, and do we have enough time to get there? And what you hear from the EU is they are sceptical. They say, we thought we were going down one track that was the political declaration, what was outlined in this piece of paper that wasn't legally binding but set out a vision of the future relationship. It seems like we're in a very different position now. When do negotiations start, and will we be able to manage and reach a deal by the end of the year?
I mean, Thomas, if we were looking for kind of a philosophical underpinning of the British position, that we got that last night. I mean, Frost saying, that the democratic consent of the British public would snap dramatically and finally if the UK continues to be tied to the European Union.
I mean, he's got a very good point. That was the whole point of Brexit. Part of it was for the UK to be able to take back control of its own laws and its own rulemaking. I think the problem with this, and that was the point which Frost made last night, this idea of sovereign equals. And in trade negotiations, there are stronger sides and there are weaker sides. And this may be a difficult realisation for the UK government to have to accept. But
we're a nation state, and they're a multinational trading bloc of 27.
Sure, the United Kingdom is an important world economy. It is a key, global actor. But nevertheless, when it comes to negotiations with the EU, it's more exposed economically to the EU than vice versa. And it's a smaller economy. I think the idea of being able to completely take back control of your rules in the international economic sphere more generally, I think is an odd idea. There are very few countries who enjoy total sovereignty. You have to give up some sovereignty when you enter into trade negotiations. So that's just the way the international talks work. So I think there does have to be, a certain degree of realisation from the UK side on that.
I mean, Andrew, if there is a point of agreement between the UK and the EU at the moment, it is that there will be economic friction as a result of whatever happens. I suppose the difference is that we diverge pretty widely on exactly the nature and the extent of that economic friction.
Yes, and this is the one thing that the government, to its credit perhaps, has started to admit now, post-election, that there will be friction, there will be a cost.
Post-referendum.
Yeah, but it will be a cost to the economy. Now, Mr. Frost yesterday disagreed with the exact quantum. Is it going to be 5% that the government's own forecasts are? Who knows? But it will be something. And the border infrastructure that will have to go in place is different than what exists there now. There is a cost to everyday life for people and to the government and to the economy. And that's a big risk to take. But at least the government's saying we're accepting that risk as the cost of saying no to free movement in the European Union and kind of ever closer union.
Yes, Richard.
No, I was just saying, I think that's absolutely right. And from the EU's perspective, there are two things, right? This is a very different trade negotiation in the sense that we're starting from a point of convergence, but we're heading towards divergence, although we don't really know what that divergence looks like. So it's how do you manage that? And the second thing that they're very worried about, particularly those member states that kind of are closest to the UK, is how is that border going to work? And not only sort of the checks between Northern Ireland and the Republic, but also that border between GB and Northern Ireland. So they are watching very carefully, because they're thinking all of this ties in together at the end.
I mean, we do have a bit of an idea of the European Union position. There was the draft document earlier this month. They want non-regression on environmental, social and workers' standards, dynamic alignment on EU state aid and competition rules. From what David Frost said last night, can we get to that point without involvement of the European Court of Justice or similar?
Well, I think what we're going to get to is a position sometime later in the year, probably post the 30th of June, which is the cut-off point for the extension of the transition period. If the two sides haven't reached an agreement, then there's going to be a political crisis of sorts. It could be argued maybe from the UK government side that they don't want the kind of deal which is an offer from the EU. But having said that, as Georgina rightly mentioned, we're starting from a point of complete convergence and we're trying to diverge. But the question is diverging to what exactly? The government did publish a short statement. It was in Parliament a few weeks ago, giving, I guess, a kind of a rough outline of the areas that they were interested in. We haven't seen the kind of detail which we've seen on the EU side. And as you mentioned, the draft negotiating mandate published a few weeks ago is meant to be finalised at the General Affairs Council of EU's Europe ministers next week. And then the talk should start in March. But it would be good, I think, for the public at large to be able to see from the UK's government, from the UK government side, what precisely is that they want to achieve, and a little bit more detail on that as well.
But I'm not sure the government even knows that. And one of the worrying things when you look back to the Canadian experience with the EU is there was a lot of preparatory work that went into our negotiating position. You talk to every business group, every industry association, all the provincial governments to get them lined up in support of your negotiation. Contrast that here in the UK, you have Scotland and Northern Ireland that aren't happy with the situation now, and you have business that runs around going, nobody's talking to us.
Is the European Union really talking about a kind of Canada-style deal in the sense of the one that you were involved with? And, it does seem that we've kind of strayed slightly from that earlier point in the negotiations when Canada kept getting mentioned. What they're asking for now seems, markedly different.
Well, and what you're seeing is a downgrading of ambition at almost every time the UK government opens its mouth, and whether that's clever prepositioning for the fact that we will end up at the end of the year with a very, very narrow agreement, or even the Australia deal, which is no deal, and have to reconstitute everything after the fact. I think they're trying to take the temperature down and bring expectation down about what they will get. Because yes, Canada, EU has already slipped from the political declaration, which was much more ambitious, even still.
Can't we take what David Frost said last night and what Boris Johnson said at Greenwich not that long ago, that actually, the United Kingdom's negotiating position at the moment is, we don't mind tariffs that much?
Yeah, and clearly there's a sense from the UK government that they want to push that message and in the EU, which is we are absolutely serious. We are leaving. This is because we want to do things differently. And actually, it's not about sort of fundamentally changing EU rules. It's about having that liberty and that freedom to be able to do so. Now, the EU's reaction to that is, well, we don't really know what that looks like, because traditionally in trade agreements, we're trying to sort of meet more or less common standards. At the moment, we're diverging from that. So how do we manage that? And this is, I think, the problem from the EU, which is how do they deal with the UK that is both an ally and potentially a competitor on their doorstep? And they're worried about that.
Well, that was the point that David Frost was trying to make. Yes, I mean, he says it's perfectly possible for the EU and the UK to be political allies and economic competitors. Is it?
Well, I think when we look at the economics and the geography of all this, of all the major non-EU countries, which are European countries, so Switzerland, Norway, Ukraine, Turkey, in one form or another, they are tied into EU rules. Turkey in a customs union, Norway in the single market, Ukraine has an association agreement. There's the EU-Switzerland agreement as well. All of them are somehow tied into the EU because the EU is such a large global rule setter and is a big market even without the United Kingdom. And I think from the UK's point of view, I think this is all a question of perception. If the UK does see itself, and the UK government sees itself as a complete sovereign equal to the European Union, or for example, the United States, they're going to be in for a very, very hard wake-up call when the reality dawns that that's not the case. If you're more exposed to one side, unfortunately, you're in a weaker negotiating position. I think what the UK government has failed to do is fail to, A, do a charm offensive, and secondly, start looking for areas where there could be convergence, focusing on them to get a kind of positive atmosphere in the talks and taking things forward.
So I think that's what they're missing. And if you look at David Frost's remarks, is the global temperature right now is not very pro-trade. You look at China, you look at the United States, they're going backwards on liberalizing trade. So the idea that Britain is going to be able to move the tide in any direction on its own, divorced from the European Union, which, whether you love it or hate it, has form negotiating around the world and setting standards across the world.
I mean, Georgina, what did you make of the reference, though, in Frost's comments last night to the ability to set regulations for new sectors, new ideas, new conditions, that the gains don't necessarily have to come from divergence in existing areas?
Yeah, and I think that was an important point, right? If you're going to leave and you're going to do things differently, you want to invest in those sectors that you think are going to be prosperous in the long term. But again, from the EU's perspective is, okay, well, that's fine, but then we want to make sure that if your companies that have in some way benefited from help from the state, and if they're exporting to our market, that they're not unfair, that's not an unfair balance between what your companies have been, the help that they've received and what they're producing and ours. But of course, that is the nature of trade. That's the nature of trade negotiations. The problem is do we have enough time to find a landing zone that is suitable to both sides?
And I suspect that will be a question we will be asking ourselves all the way up to the end of the year. Georgina, right, Andrew McDougall, Thomas Cole, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.